No sewers, no clean water. Life during the brutal Industrial Revolution years was a slow, invisible, merciless death sentence for millions of human beings who never asked for any of it. No sewers or clean water, and yet the politicians stood in Parliament and called it progress. The factory owners raised their glasses of imported wine and called it prosperity. The newspapers printed their headlines about the triumph of British ingenuity, about steam and iron and empire, and not one of them, not a single one, bothered to mention the people who were dying in the dark so that all of that progress could exist. Picture this: London, England. The year is 1842. A sprawling, heaving, suffocating city of nearly 2 million people crammed into a space that was never designed to hold them. The streets in the wealthy districts of Mayfair and Belgravia were wide and gaslit, lined with carriages and gentlemen in top hats and women in silk dresses who stepped carefully around puddles as if the greatest inconvenience in life was a muddied hem. But cross the river. Walk south over London Bridge into the borough of Southwark, and you entered a different world entirely, a world that existed in the shadow of the one above it, a world that the other London preferred to pretend was not there. The River Thames, once a lifeline for the city, had become something unspeakable. It was an open sewer, a wide, slow-moving channel of filth that carried the collective waste of an entire metropolis. Factory chemicals poured into it from 100 different outlets. Tanneries dumped animal skins and chemical runoff directly into the water. Slaughterhouses released rivers of blood and offal that mingled with the human sewage already flowing from every overcrowded neighborhood on both banks. The color of the Thames in those years was not blue or green or even brown. It was black, a thick, oily, impenetrable black that caught the light in a way that made it look almost alive, as though something was moving beneath the surface that no one wanted to see. And the smell. The smell was a physical force. In summer, when the heat pressed down on the city like a hand, the stench rose from the river and spread across London in waves so powerful that members of Parliament, whose chambers sat directly beside the water, soaked curtains in chloride of lime and hung them over the windows just to be able to breathe long enough to finish their debates. They called it the Great Stink. But for the people living in Southwark, there was nothing great about it. There was only the constant, inescapable reality of living beside a river of poison and having no choice but to stay. In a cramped, crumbling tenement building on Mint Street, in the heart of Southwark, a young woman named Ada Whitmore stood at a public water pump in the grey light of early morning. She was thin, not from fashion but from hunger, with dark hair pulled back tightly under a cloth cap and hands that were red and cracked from years of factory work. She placed a dented tin cup beneath the pump spout, worked the handle 3 times, and watched as water, cloudy and faintly yellow, filled the cup. She brought it to her lips and drank without hesitation, because she had been drinking from this pump every day of her life, and because there was nothing else to drink, and because no one had ever told her, not once, that the water coming out of that pump was drawn from a well that sat directly above a cesspool leaking human waste into the ground. She wiped her mouth, filled a second cup for her brother, and carried it inside. She had no way of knowing, no possible way of understanding, that what she held in her hand was not water. It was a death sentence with no judge, no jury, and no appeal. Ada was 23 years old. She had started working at the age of 8, first as a scavenger in a cotton mill, a job that required small children to crawl beneath the enormous spinning machines while they were still running, picking up loose threads and waste cotton from the floor, their tiny bodies inches from gears and belts that could crush a hand or tear off a finger in a fraction of a second. 2 children in her first year at the mill lost fingers. One, a boy named William, who was 7 years old, lost his entire right hand when his sleeve caught in a spinning mechanism. He was carried out of the factory screaming, and Ada never saw him again. No one ever mentioned his name after that day. The machines were cleaned, a new boy was brought in, and work continued. That was the way of things. By 23, Ada had graduated to a full spinner position, standing on her feet for 14 hours each day in a room so thick with cotton dust that the air itself looked white. The noise was deafening, a relentless mechanical roar that made conversation impossible and left a ringing in the ears that never fully faded, even in sleep. The women communicated through hand signals and lip reading. They ate their meals when there were meals, standing at their stations because sitting was not permitted. They were docked pay for arriving late, for coughing too long, for using the privy more than twice in a shift. Ada's fingers were permanently split at the tips. The skin cracked open in lines that bled each morning when she first gripped the thread, and her lungs carried a heaviness that no amount of fresh air, not that there was any fresh air in Southwark, could seem to clear. She shared a single room with her younger brother Thomas and their mother Ellen. The room was approximately 10 feet by 10 feet, with one small window that faced a brick wall and let in almost no light. The walls were damp year-round, streaked with dark stains of mold that crept upward from the floor like fingers. The floor itself was bare wood, warped and soft in places from moisture, and the three of them slept on straw mattresses laid side by side, their bodies so close that Ada could feel her mother's breathing against her back throughout the night. Thomas was 9 years old, small for his age, with wide, serious eyes that had already witnessed more suffering than most adults should ever have to bear. He did odd jobs when he could find them, running messages, sweeping shop fronts, carrying parcels, but most of the time he waited in the room alone while Ada and Ellen worked, staring at the wall and listening to the sounds of the street below. Ellen was 47, though she looked at least 60. She had been a washerwoman for over 25 years, spending her days bent over wooden tubs of scalding water, scrubbing the clothes and linens of wealthier families who lived north of the river. Her hands were enormous and swollen from the lye soap, and her spine had begun to curve forward permanently, a slow bowing of the vertebrae that made her walk with a shuffling, hunched gait that caused strangers to mistake her for a much older woman. She never complained. Not once in all the years Ada could remember had Ellen Whitmore complained about her life. She simply worked day after day because there was nothing else to do and no one coming to save them. Mint Street itself was a horror. There is no gentle way to describe it. Open gutters ran down the center of the narrow road, carrying a thick, slow-moving sludge of human waste, rotting food, dead rats, and substances no one cared to identify. The buildings on either side leaned toward each other like drunken men, blocking out most of the sky and creating a permanent twilight at street level even on the brightest days. Families of 8, 10, sometimes 12 people lived in rooms meant for 2. Children played in the gutters because there was nowhere else to play. Babies crawled on floors slick with dampness and filth. And beneath nearly every building, cesspools had been dug to collect human waste. Cesspools that were rarely emptied because emptying them cost money that no one had. Cesspools that leaked steadily, silently, inevitably into the same groundwater that fed the pumps that every family on the street depended on for their drinking water. Nobody understood the connection. Nobody in 1842 knew that the water coming out of those pumps was contaminated with cholera, with typhoid, with a dozen different diseases that bred and multiplied in the raw sewage seeping through the earth. The prevailing medical theory was miasma, the conviction that disease was caused not by germs or contamination, but by foul air, by invisible poisons that floated in fog and bad smells. Doctors, scientists, and politicians all agreed. If you wanted to avoid sickness, you avoided bad air. You kept your windows shut at night. You burned herbs in your room. And you continued drinking the water because the water had nothing to do with it. So the people of Mint Street sealed their windows against the fog and drank from their pumps without a second thought, never knowing that every cup, every sip, was a game of chance with death. It started with Thomas. One evening in late September, the boy came home from running errands and said his stomach hurt. Ada gave him a piece of bread and told him to rest. By midnight, the stomach pain had become something else entirely. Thomas was doubled over on his mattress, his small body racked with cramps so violent that he could not straighten his legs. Then came the vomiting, a thin, clear fluid that kept coming even when there was nothing left inside him. Then the diarrhea, sudden and uncontrollable, soaking through the mattress and onto the floor. His skin turned a ghastly grey-blue color, his eyes sank into his skull, and his lips cracked from dehydration so rapidly that it looked as though his body was emptying itself of every drop of moisture it contained. Ellen held him on the floor, rocking him like an infant, pressing damp rags to his forehead with hands that would not stop shaking. Ada threw a shawl over her nightclothes and ran barefoot into the streets. She ran for nearly an hour. She knocked on doors. She begged. She pleaded. Most of the doctors in the area had either fled South London entirely or refused to enter the cholera-ridden streets of Southwark for any fee, let alone for no fee at all. Finally, at nearly 2 in the morning, Ada found a man, a surgeon of middling reputation with gin on his breath and exhaustion in his eyes, who agreed to follow her back to Mint Street. He knelt beside Thomas for less than a minute. He felt the boy's pulse, looked at the color of his skin, and stood up. "Cholera," he said, his voice neither kind nor unkind, but simply flat, the voice of a man who had said this word too many times already that week. "Keep him warm. Give him whatever water you can get into him. Boil it if you are able. And pray, because I have nothing in my bag that can help him. I am sorry." He left without asking for payment, which was fortunate because Ada had nothing to give. She stood in the doorway of their room, listening to her mother whispering prayers over Thomas's shivering body, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not sadness. Something harder than sadness. Something closer to fury. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like these, raw, real, and deliberately erased from the history books, are exactly what we bring to you every single week. If you believe these forgotten voices deserve to be heard, if you believe the truth matters more than comfort, subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a single chapter. Thomas survived. It took 11 days. 11 days of Ada and Ellen taking turns beside him on the damp floor, spooning tiny sips of boiled water between his cracked, bleeding lips. 11 days of cleaning him, of holding him when the cramps returned, of speaking to him in low, steady voices even when they were not sure he could hear them. 11 days of waiting for a knock on the door that might be the parish cart come to collect a body. The knock never came. On the 12th morning, Thomas opened his eyes, blinked at the pale light leaking through the window, and said in a voice barely louder than a breath, "Ada, I am hungry." Ada pressed her face into the straw mattress so her brother would not see her cry. But cholera had not finished with Mint Street. The disease moved through the neighborhood like something deliberate, like something with intention, passing from household to household with a patience that felt almost cruel. Within 2 weeks of Thomas falling ill, the death toll on Mint Street and the surrounding lanes had climbed past 20. A baby girl named Rose, just 11 months old, died 2 doors down from the Whitmores. Her mother, a woman named Catherine, sat on the floor of her room holding the child's body for 6 hours before anyone could convince her to let go. She did not scream. She did not weep. She simply sat there staring at the far wall with eyes that had gone somewhere no one else could follow. Rose's father, a bricklayer named George, stood in the corridor outside their room with his forehead pressed against the damp plaster, his fists clenched at his sides, his body vibrating with a rage that had no outlet and no target, because the thing that had killed his daughter was invisible, unnamed, and everywhere. An old man called Mr. Pennell, 71 years of age, a dock worker who had survived falls from ship rigging, a broken back, 2 bouts of influenza, and a knife wound from a bar fight in his youth, was found dead in his bed on a Thursday morning by his neighbor. He had been perfectly well the day before. He had complained of mild stomach cramps at supper, gone to sleep and never woke up. 71 years of survival, of endurance, of sheer bloody-minded refusal to die, ended by a single cup of water, drawn from a pump that sat above a pit of human waste. A young mother named Sarah Harding, 32 years old, mother of 5 children between the ages of 2 and 11, did not wake up one Tuesday morning. Her eldest daughter, a girl named Mary who was 11, shook her mother's shoulder again and again in the grey pre-dawn light before she finally understood that her mother's skin was cold and that the shaking would not work. Mary walked to the mill where her mother had been expected that morning and told the foreman that her mother was dead. The foreman noted it in his ledger, deducted the cost of a replacement worker from the week's accounts, and told Mary to go home. The parish sent a cart that afternoon. Sarah's body was wrapped in a thin sheet and placed beside 2 others already on the cart. Her children stood in the doorway and watched it roll away. There was no funeral. There was no ceremony. There was only the sound of wooden wheels on wet cobblestones, fading into the fog, Ada watched all of it. She watched with the eyes of someone who had been forced awake and could not close them again. And the more she watched, the more certain she became of something that she could not prove but could not ignore. The families who drew their water from the Broad Street pump, the pump closest to their building, fell ill at a rate that was visibly, undeniably higher than those who, for whatever reason, walked the extra distance to a different pump or collected rainwater from barrels on their roofs. It was not a theory formed in a laboratory. It was an observation made by a woman who had nothing but her eyes and her instincts. But it was correct. She made the mistake of sharing her observation with the mill foreman, Hargrove. She approached him during the brief midday break, choosing her words carefully, keeping her voice low and respectful. She told him she had noticed a pattern. She told him the sickness seemed to follow the water, not the air. Hargrove was a thick-bodied man with red cheeks and a manner that oscillated between dismissive and outright contemptuous of anyone beneath his station, which was nearly everyone. He listened to Ada for approximately 15 seconds before letting out a laugh so loud that it turned heads across the factory floor. "You think the water is making people sick?" he said, grinning as though Ada had told him the funniest joke he had heard in years. "And where did you receive your medical training, girl? Was it between your shifts at the loom? It is the air, the miasma. Every physician in London will tell you the same. Now get back to your position before I dock you a shilling for wasting my time with this nonsense." Ada returned to her loom. She said nothing, but she did not stop watching, and she did not stop thinking. That evening she found a small notebook, a thin thing with a battered cover, discarded in the refuse pile outside a church school. She took it home, found a stub of pencil, and began recording everything she could observe. She wrote down the names of families who had fallen ill. She noted the dates when symptoms first appeared. She marked which pump each family used. She drew a rough, clumsy map of Mint Street and the surrounding lanes, placing small crosses at the homes where cholera had struck and circles at the locations of water pumps. She did this each evening by the light of a single tallow candle, hunched over the notebook on her lap while Thomas slept beside her, and Ellen coughed in the darkness. She tried to warn her neighbors. She went door to door on the few hours she had free on Sundays, knocking gently, speaking carefully, trying not to frighten anyone but trying to be heard. Mrs. Doyle, the widow next door, listened with kindness, but shook her head slowly. "I hear what you are saying, Ada, and I know you mean well. But what do you expect us to do? The pump is all we have. We cannot afford to buy ale for drinking. The river is worse than the pump. Where else are we supposed to go?" Ada had no answer for that because Mrs. Doyle was right. The cruelest dimension of the entire situation was that even if Ada could prove beyond any shadow of doubt that the water was poisoned, the people of Mint Street had no alternative. They were trapped. Poverty had sealed every exit. Mrs. Caldwell, the landlady, was less sympathetic. She intercepted Ada on the stairwell one evening, blocking the narrow passage with her considerable frame, her eyes hard and cold as stones. "I have heard what you have been saying to the tenants," she said, her voice low and threatening. "You are telling people the water is dangerous. You are scaring families. Do you know what happens when families get scared? They leave. And when they leave, I lose rent. So let me be very clear with you, girl. You are not a doctor. You are not a scientist. You are a mill worker who lives in my building on my charity. And if I hear one more word of this water nonsense from your mouth, you and your mother and your brother will be on the street by morning. Do you understand me?" Ada understood. She lowered her eyes, nodded, and went back to her room. But she did not close her notebook. She hid it under her mattress and continued writing each night by candlelight. If this story is sitting heavy on your chest right now, if you can feel the weight of what these people endured, drop a comment and tell us what you are thinking. Your voice matters here more than you know. The weeks passed. Autumn deepened. The rain came more frequently, and with it the gutters overflowed more often, spreading their contents across the streets and into the ground floors of buildings. The damp in the Whitmore's room grew worse. Dark patches of mold expanded across the walls, like maps of countries no one wanted to visit. And Ellen's cough, which had been a constant but manageable presence for years, began to change. It grew deeper, wetter, more insistent. It came in fits that lasted minutes at a time. fit so violent that Ellen would double over with her hands on her knees, her face turning red, then purple, then a shade of grey that terrified Ada every time she saw it. The cough woke Thomas in the night. It woke the neighbours through the thin walls. It became the rhythm of their lives, the metronome against which every other sound was measured. Ada took Ellen to a free dispensary near London Bridge, a cramped, overcrowded room staffed by a single exhausted physician and 2 volunteer nurses. The doctor listened to Ellen's chest with a wooden stethoscope, asked her to breathe deeply, which provocation a coughing fit that lasted nearly 3 minutes, and then stepped aside to speak with Ada in a low voice. "Your mother's lungs are severely compromised," he said. "Years of damp, of dust, of malnutrition. The damage is extensive. I can give her a tincture that may ease the coughing, but I must be honest with you, the underlying condition will not improve. She needs rest, clean air, nourishing food and warmth. She needs things that..." He trailed off because they both knew the end of that sentence. She needs things that you cannot give her. She needs things that the world has decided she does not deserve. One cold October evening, Ada was walking home from the mill through Borough Market. The market was closing for the day, and the vendors were packing up their stalls, sweeping fish scales and vegetable scraps into the gutters. Ada walked quickly, her shawl pulled tight against the chill, her mind already on the evening's tasks, boiling water, preparing whatever food they had, checking on Ellen, helping Thomas with the reading exercises she had been teaching him from a Bible she had borrowed from the parish church. But as she passed a narrow side street, she heard a voice. It was coming from inside a small lecture hall, a plain brick building with an open door, and a modest sign advertising a public talk on the subject of sanitation and disease. Ada almost walked past. She was tired. Her feet ached. She had been standing for 14 hours, but something in the speaker's tone, a calm urgency, a careful precision, made her stop. She stepped closer to the doorway and listened. Inside, a man stood at the front of a small room, addressing a crowd of perhaps 30 people. He was of medium build, neatly dressed but not wealthy, with a serious face and careful hands that moved as he spoke. He was holding up a hand-drawn map of a London neighbourhood and pointing to specific locations marked on it. His name was Dr. John Snow, and he was saying something that made Ada's entire body go still. He was saying that cholera was not spread by bad air. He was saying that the miasma theory, the theory that every doctor and politician and factory owner in England believed with absolute certainty, was wrong. He was saying that cholera was transmitted through contaminated water, through specific pumps, through wells that drew from poisoned ground. He had evidence, he had data. He had mapped outbreaks and traced them to their sources, and demonstrated with mathematical precision that the pattern of death followed the water supply, not the direction of the wind or the density of the fog. Ada stood at the back of the room with her pulse hammering in her throat. Her hands were shaking. Everything she had suspected, everything she had observed and recorded and been mocked for, everything she had been threatened over. This man was saying it aloud in a room full of people, and he was not guessing. He had proof, maps, numbers, a logical chain of evidence that connected the water to the sickness in a way that could not be dismissed as the ramblings of an uneducated mill girl. She stayed until the lecture ended, standing pressed against the back wall, barely breathing, absorbing every word. When the crowd dispersed, Ada did not leave. She waited until the room was nearly empty, then approached Dr. Snow on legs that felt unsteady beneath her. Her mouth was dry. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her fingertips. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the battered notebook. She opened it to the first page, where the messy handwriting began, and held it out to him without speaking. Dr. Snow took the notebook. He studied the first page for a moment, then turned to the second, then the third. He looked at her crude map of Mint Street, with its crosses and circles. He examined the lists of names, the dates, the tally marks. He spent several minutes reading in silence while Ada stood before him, a cotton mill worker in a stained apron and a threadbare shawl, offering her observations to a man of science and hoping with every fiber of her being that he would not laugh. He did not laugh. He looked up from the notebook and studied her face with an expression that Ada had never once in her life received from anyone in a position of authority. It was respect. Pure, unguarded, genuine respect. "For you have been doing my work," he said quietly, "without anyone teaching you how. How long have you been collecting this data?" Ada told him. She told him about the pump. She told him about the pattern. She told him about Thomas's illness and the deaths on Mint Street. She told him about Hargrove's ridicule and Mrs. Caldwell's threats. She told him everything, the words pouring out of her in a rush that she could not stop and did not want to, because for the first time in her 23 years of life, someone was listening. Dr. Snow asked her questions, detailed, methodical, respectful questions. He asked about the exact location of the Broad Street pump relative to the cesspools. He asked about the timeline of illness in specific households. He asked which families had used the pump and which had not. He treated her answers as data, as evidence, as material of genuine scientific value. He copied several entries from her notebook into his own. And when he was finished, he looked at her and said, "What you have done is remarkable. You have confirmed independently what I have been trying to prove for months. I cannot promise you that the authorities will listen, but I promise you that I will not stop until they do." If this moment is making you feel something deep inside, if you feel the weight of what Ada went through, type in the comments right now, "Their suffering was real, and it should never be forgotten." Let us fill the entire comment section with that truth and make it impossible for anyone scrolling past to ignore. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Snow intensified his investigation, and Ada's observations from Mint Street became a small but significant thread in the larger tapestry of evidence he was building. He mapped every cholera death in the Broad Street area. He interviewed families. He tested water sources. He compiled a body of evidence so detailed and so compelling that even the skeptics found it difficult to dismiss entirely. Eventually, reluctantly, the local authorities agreed to act. The handle of the Broad Street pump was removed, physically taken off so that no one could draw water from it. The outbreak, which had been devastating the neighborhood for weeks, slowed almost immediately. New cases dropped. Within a fortnight, the cholera that had haunted those streets began to retreat. But for Ada Whitmore, the victory arrived wrapped in grief. Ellen had grown worse. Much worse. The cough that had been a constant companion for years had deepened into something that sounded like drowning. The doctor at the dispensary had been right. The damage was too extensive, too deeply embedded in her mother's body. Decades of breathing factory dust, of working in damp, unventilated rooms, of drinking water contaminated with things that no human body was ever meant to consume, of eating food that was insufficient and of poor quality, of sleeping in rooms where the walls wept moisture and the air tasted of mold. All of it had accumulated inside Ellen like a debt that could never be repaid. Her lungs were failing. No removed pump handle, no act of parliament, no scientific discovery could undo what 25 years of poverty had done to her body. Ada sat beside her mother each evening after work, holding her hand, listening to the terrible sound of her breathing, and understood with a clarity that felt like a blade pressed against her chest that progress would come. She believed it now. She had seen it begin. But it would come too late for her mother, too late for baby Rose, too late for Mr. Pennell, too late for Sarah Harding's children. Progress, she realized, was not a gift. It was a tide, and tides do not care who drowns before they turn. Ellen Whitmore died on a grey Tuesday morning in November of 1843. The rain had not stopped falling for 3 consecutive days, and the gutters of Mint Street ran full with the same black sludge that had been there when Ellen first moved to the street more than 20 years earlier. Nothing on the surface had changed. The same buildings leaned at the same angles. The same smell hung in the same air. The same pump stood at the same corner, though its handle had been removed and its mouth sealed shut with an iron plate. Ellen had been awake most of the night, her coughing growing steadily quieter. Not better, but quieter, as though her body was running out of the strength to fight even the cough. Ida sat beside her on the floor, holding her mother's hand, which had grown lighter and thinner with each passing week, until it felt like holding a bundle of dry sticks wrapped in paper. Thomas sat on the other side, his small body pressed against his mother's arm, his face buried in the blanket. Ellen opened her eyes once near dawn. She looked at Ada, and something passed between them that words could not hold. A lifetime of exhaustion and love compressed into a single glance. Ellen's lips moved, but no sound came. Ada leaned closer. "Take care of him," Ellen whispered, and Ada nodded, and then Ellen's eyes closed, and her breathing slowed, and then it stopped, and the room fell into a silence so complete that Ada could hear the rain dripping from the eaves outside the window. They buried Ellen at Cross Bones, a pauper's cemetery on the south bank of the Thames, where hundreds, possibly thousands, of Southwark's poorest had been laid to rest in unmarked graves over the centuries. There was no headstone. There was no priest. Just a rectangular hole in the wet earth, a thin wooden box, and two figures standing beside it in the rain. Thomas held Ada's hand so tightly that the blood left her fingers, but she did not pull away. She stood perfectly still, looking down at the box that held everything that remained of the woman who had washed other people's clothes until her spine curved like a bow, who had never once complained, who had raised two children in a room the size of a cupboard on a street that smelled of death, and who had loved them with a ferocity that the world had never recognized or rewarded. Ada did not collapse. She went back to the mill the next morning at 5 o'clock, because the alternative was starvation. She worked her 14 hours. She went home. She boiled water. She made Thomas eat. And then she sat down on the floor of their empty feeling room and opened her notebook and continued writing, because the notebook had become something more than a record. It had become a promise that someone, somewhere, would remember what had happened, that the dying would not go unwitnessed. She raised Thomas with a devotion that bordered on fierceness. She taught him to read, spending Sundays at the parish school library, guiding his small finger across the pages of borrowed books until the letters became words, and the words became sentences, and the sentences became a doorway into a world larger than Mint Street. She taught him to write his name, then other people's names, then full sentences. She taught him mathematics using the tally marks in her notebook, and she made him promise, with a seriousness that she had never applied to anything else in her life, that he would never, ever drink water from any source without first understanding where it came from and what lay beneath the ground around it. She told him about the pump. She told him about Dr. Snow. She told him about the notebook and the crosses on the map and the families who had died. She told him everything, because she understood that knowledge was the only inheritance she had to leave him, and she was determined that it would be enough. Every Sunday, regardless of the weather, Ada walked past the sealed Broad Street pump. She stood before it for a moment, looking at the iron plate that covered its spout, and allowed herself a feeling she rarely permitted in any other context, a quiet, private sense of vindication. She had been right. A cotton mill worker with split fingers and a borrowed notebook had been right when every physician, every politician, every factory owner, and every landlady in London had been wrong. And even though her name would never be written in any scientific paper, even though Dr. Snow's published work would never mention the young woman from Mint Street who had shown him her notes in a lecture hall near Borough Market, she knew. And on those Sunday mornings, standing before the sealed pump in the cold, that knowing was enough. In the decades that followed, London was forced by sheer accumulated horror to confront the reality of what it had been doing to its own people. The Great Stink of 1858, when the smell of the Thames became so overpowering that Parliament could no longer function, finally pushed the government to act on a scale commensurate with the problem. Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer of extraordinary vision and determination, designed and oversaw the construction of a vast underground sewer system, over 80 miles of brick-lined tunnels that would carry London's waste downriver and away from its drinking supply. It was one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 19th century, and it saved countless lives. Parliament passed the Public Health Acts, establishing boards of health and requiring local authorities to address sanitation, water supply, and drainage. Slowly, painfully, decade by decade, clean water began its transformation from a luxury enjoyed exclusively by the wealthy into something that approached, however imperfectly, a basic human right. But none of it came soon enough. That is the sentence that hangs over this entire story like a weight that cannot be lifted. None of it came soon enough for the thousands already buried in unmarked graves across Southwark, Bermondsey, Whitechapel, Bethnal Green, and a dozen other neighbourhoods where the poor had been abandoned to disease and filth by a society that valued their labour but not their lives. None of it came soon enough for Ellen Whitmore, who washed clothes until her spine broke and then kept washing. None of it came soon enough for baby Rose, who never learned to walk. None of it came soon enough for Mr. Pennell, who survived 71 years of hardship only to be killed by a glass of water. None of it came soon enough for Sarah Harding, whose 5 children watched a parish cart carry their mother away on a rainy Tuesday morning and were never the same again. The Industrial Revolution gave humanity things that were genuinely extraordinary. It gave us railways that shrank distances, factories that produced goods on a scale never before imagined, steam engines that harnessed the power of nature in ways that transformed every aspect of human existence, telegraph wires that carried messages across continents at the speed of light, iron bridges that spanned rivers, ships that crossed oceans. It reshaped the world utterly and permanently, and the echoes of that transformation are still audible in everything we build, everything we make, everything we are. But the Industrial Revolution also produced human suffering on a scale that most history books, even now, choose to mention only in passing. A paragraph between celebrations of invention, a footnote beneath a diagram of a steam engine. The smoke and the steel came at a cost, and that cost was not measured in pounds or shillings or investment returns. It was measured in human lives, in mothers who coughed until their lungs collapsed, in children who drank poison because nobody told them the water was unsafe, in fathers who stood in hallways pressing their fists against walls because their daughters had died and there was nothing they could do, in workers who were used up, ground down and discarded by an economic system that saw them not as people, but as inputs, as fuel, as expendable components of a machine designed to produce wealth for someone else. Ada Whitmore's name does not appear in any history book, neither does Ellen's, neither does Thomas's, neither does Rose's, or Mr. Pennell's, or Sarah Harding's. But their story was the story of millions, not only in England, but across every nation that followed the same path of industrialization, repeating the same mistakes, sacrificing the same people, and arriving at the same painful revelations decades too late. And if we allow ourselves to forget them, if we tell the story of progress without telling theirs, if we celebrate the machines without mourning the human beings who were broken beneath their gears, then we forget the true cost. The brutal, unforgivable, unforgettable cost of everything we now take for granted. If you watched until the very end, it is because this story genuinely moved something inside you. Leave a comment right now saying, "I watched until the end," so that I can meet you personally and know exactly who truly cares about the stories we tell on this channel. If this story touched your heart, if it made you see the past differently even for a moment, hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to this channel. And share this video. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Send it to someone who values truth over comfort, who believes that the people history forgot still deserve to be remembered. And if you are not yet subscribed, this is your moment. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story that the world tried to bury and silence forever. These stories matter. These people mattered. And as long as this channel exists, they will never be forgotten again. We will see you in the next one.